But before I move on to the campaigns themselves, which I want to say a bit about, I just want to say something about an issue which has arisen time and time again in the public meetings I've been at during the last 6 months or so, and that's a complaint that the campaign, that there was a lot of media bias in the campaign, and that the media was biased against yes and independence. Now, whether this was the case, and if so, to what extent and how important it is something that merits serious investigation. I don't mean by the police, I mean by academics who can count column inches and analyse the use of language, loaded words and unflattering terminology, and so on. The only bit of serious research I've seen so far on this related to the period up till March this year. And the conclusion that young academic came up with was that by and large the Scottish press had been reasonably even-handed, but the London papers, the Daily Telegraph and the Scottish editions of papers like the Daily Mail were clearly hostile to independence. And it's certainly the case that only one Scottish paper came out firmly in favour of yes, and that was the Sunday Herald. Now, I'm going to take some shortcuts here. In my view, the BBC was very balanced during this campaign. You may not agree with me, we can talk about that afterwards, but I know from my own experience that was the case, that producers were desperately concerned for their livelihoods, in a sense, if they were seen to favour one side or the other. I can give you examples of that sort of thing. As far as the written media is concerned, I thought the newspapers, in Scotland anyway, gave space to both sides of the argument, and indeed all extremes of the argument. So, for example, the Scotsman carried one of the most passionately argued pro-independence pieces I saw during the whole of the campaign, and that was Billy Kay's piece a few weeks ago. And there were, of course, columns from the union's perspective too. Editorials were clearly slanted, but my question is how many people actually read editorials? And the other question I have is this. Okay, the Scotsman and the Herald, not the Sunday Herald, were not in favour of yes or independence, but actually how many readers do they have? Well, I'll tell you, it's less than 100,000 between them, out of an electorate of something like 4 million people. So the press is that's not a lot. And so it raises questions about just how influential the media is. But the most striking the most striking aspect of this, as far as I'm concerned, is this, that the most widely read papers in Glasgow and the rest of Scotland are the Daily Record and the Glasgow Herald. And neither of these come out for yes, yet it was in Glasgow that we saw the biggest yes vote. And this suggests to me that most people make up their own minds, regardless of what the big bag-pressed barons would have them do. So, now, the first aspect then of the result is that sizable vote for yes. But the second aspect of the result that's drawn little or no comment that I know about is this. 55% of the electorate said no. No thanks to independence, and preferred to remain within the United Kingdom. Now, as an historian, I think this is quite remarkable. And there are a variety of reasons why I say that. First, in 1767, when we got into this thing in the first place, when the Union was being debated in the pre-Union Scottish Parliament, there is no doubt that out there on the streets, that if there had been a referendum, there would have been a no vote to going into the Union in 1767. That's the first thing. Secondly, the Union remained profoundly unpopular in Scotland for 30 or 40 years after it was inaugurated. That's why we had the Jacobite risings. Thirdly, the Union has actually rarely been popular in the sense that people have celebrated, or actually haven't celebrated it. If you look at the major anniversary dates, 1807, 1907, 2007, celebrations actually have been fairly muted and hardly noticed, in fact, by most Scots. Fourthly, whilst within the Union state, the British Union state, there wasn't until the 1930s a Scottish Nationalist Party. There has been from the time of 1707 onwards an uneven but pulsing sense of Scottish distinctiveness, of difference from England. as well as a firm belief in Scotland as a nation, albeit within the United Kingdom. And fifthly, in the last half-century, for the reasons that I've just outlined, the pillars upon which the Union was built have weakened, and partly owing to the rise of the nationalists since the 1970s, it has come under, as the Union has come under, increasing challenge. And yet, on the 18th of September, 55% of an enormously enlarged electorate voted to remain within the United Kingdom. No one. Indeed, there's a case for saying that while support for independence is at an all-time high, support for the Union is incredibly high as well. A large majority of Scots, in other words, feel comfortable to varying degrees within the United Kingdom and don't want to see it broken up. In fact, we should remember, and we sometimes forget this, that at least one, we should not forget this. Maybe you didn't know it already, so I can't forget it, I'm sorry. But 500 years ago, it was a Scot, John Mayer, who first proposed that Scotland and England should be united. And that for 400 years, that's 500 years ago when he first argued that, for 400 years we've been in a union with England in terms of the union of the Crown, and for 300 plus years we've had the current union of the Parliament. And that is a long time. And as the saying goes, old habits break hard. It's not as if we got ourselves into the union 10 years ago, 20 years ago. It was 300 years ago, 400 years ago. We've been pushing, or Scots were pushing for a union for 500 years. Now, of course, there were a variety of reasons why people voted no. But it seems to me highly likely that consciously or otherwise they did so for some of the same reasons that some Scots in the late 17th and early 18th century took us into the Union in the first place. And some of them, the reasons at the time were these, and I think if you listen carefully, you'll see that they still have resonance today. Firstly, we shared the same small island mass. Secondly, we spoke more or less the same language. Thirdly, we had much in common in terms of culture. And fourthly, although this is clearly less relevant today, we adopted in England and Scotland the same religion, Protestantism, although with variants of it, of course, on both sides of the border, on each side of the border. And there was another factor too, and that was that as separate countries, we, that is England and Scotland, tended to squabble and sometimes went to war. That was the history of England and Scotland right up till the Union. And in fact, a war was on the verge of breaking out immediately prior to the Union of 1707. Now, while it's highly unlikely that this would happen again in the 21st century, separation, many people felt, would have led to tensions and divisions and the implementation of policies, say on the economy, that would have been damaging to both sides. And the fact is too that even in the cases, I should stop and pause, the fact is that even in the case of amicable separations between human beings, between former partners, there are usually arguments about who gets what and nobody gets entirely what they wanted. But perhaps all in 1700, in terms of the Union of 1707, perhaps all in terms of reasons for it, was the fact that Scotland's economy was then underdeveloped and needed, the Scots needed England as a market, and the Scots needed access to England's colonial markets overseas. Now, today, of course, the colonial empire has gone, but the English market is still the most important one for Scottish exporters, and my guess is that a lot of voters were concerned that this would be threatened by independence. So, there's some comments on the result itself.